I will share my experience in the IIT Bombay, where in 2010 they had invited me to share platform with Mr. Adi Godrej. And he was to speak first and I was to speak later. It was a very, very tough program. Research scholars, students, academics, all were there. And he spoke brilliantly for an hour, in which the quintessence of his thought was that India has been a great civilization. It knew philosophy, it knew spirituality, it knew how to coexist with differing thoughts. But the one area where it has been a thorough failure was economics. And we started putting up economic performance only after globalization came in. Otherwise, we had only what is known as the Hindu rate of growth. You know, the entire audience clapped. And he was given a roaring reception. And I had gone with a particular mindset to speak, and I had gone with certain points. I kept aside all the points because I was surprised that in such an institution of such high learning, which is going to brand India, which is going to represent India as a rising intellectual giant, IITs, IIMs, I was surprised at the kind of ignorance about India. So I decided to keep aside the notes which I had taken and began talking on what is the current Western understanding about the Indian economic performance. You know, our mind about India was made by scholars who never visited India, who never dealt with Indians, who never read any Indian literature. Take two persons, for instance, Karl Marx. In the year 1853, before he wrote the Das Kapital in 1857, Karl Marx wrote a couple of articles actually on 25th June 1853. In the New York Herald Tribune, he wrote two articles in which he traced what his understanding about India was. He said it is a very peculiar country. It's one country, no doubt. And it has some kind of a centralized living model. And it is infrastructure and the mobility of the people are looked after by king who somehow function together. But economically, if you look at that country, every village is an economic unit. It is a tariff unit. And it doesn't import or export anything. It produces and consumes. The producer is also the consumer. Consumer is also the producer, which he later on called the Asiatic method of production. He said it's a very peculiar country. And there is no economic inequality because no one has any power over others. This was called primitive socialism in the communist terminology even today. But he said there is something very wrong with this society. They are worshipping monkeys. They are worshipping cows. And such a backward society can never progress and carry out a revolution which is necessary for advancement of the human race. It is necessary to destroy the social base, the society. And that work the British is doing, even though it is a very painful destruction, it is a pleasurable destruction also. This is what Karl Marx said. You know, the man never came to India, he never read in Indian literature, he never met any Indian and spoken about India, but he wrote about India, and you know, he became one of the most powerful thinkers influencing the Indian intellectual establishment, political establishment, sociology, and economic thinking. And our academics are still under the grip of this powerful thought that India is semi-barbaric. This is what he classified India as. And then another person, Max Weber, less known but a more powerful social thinker, he was the man who aligned economics and sociology. He wrote a book called Sociology of Economics, which defined why the Protestant societies are coming up and Catholic societies are lagging behind. And he said that Protestant societies, because they release a person from the control of the church and from the control of the hierarchy, it opens a person to individualism, entrepreneurship, enterprise, and so they are more fitted to handle capitalism. And he predicted in early 1900 that America would become an economic power only because of the Protestant ethic. He was absolutely right. As for the Christendom, the relative values of capitalism with Protestant Christianity and Catholic Christianity. And he is one of the most powerful and influential thinkers of the sociological and economic establishments and academics all over the world today. And there are researches which show that these two thinkers influenced Indian establishment more than any other intellectuals. And I would have been very happy if Max Weber had stopped writing with only his understanding about Europe and America. But he wrote a book in 1925 which was not published till 1950. That was about the religion of Hinduism and Buddhism, in which he said two societies can never come up. That is China and India, because they believe in karma and rebirth, which is anti-enterprise, anti-entrepreneurial development, and so these two nations can never come up. You know, researchers after researchers have confirmed that Indian political, sociological, economic and political establishments have been powerfully influenced by these two thinkers. And afterwards, John Kenneth Galbraith came here, a great friend of Pandit Nehru, and he said, I can't understand, India is a functioning anarchy. That it is an anarchic society, but surprisingly it is functioning also. And we quoted all this. We defined ourselves through Karl Marx, through Max Weber, through Galbraith, and came Professor Raj Krishna. He was asked why India is growing so slowly. He said it is Hindu rate of growth. This was 1978. That's how we defined India. India was defined by people who had nothing to do with India, nothing to do with understanding the Indian society or Indian civilization. And a remarkable U-turn took place in the world about which no one has cared to understand. That in 1970s, when Japan began rising as an economic power, the West was surprised. Because economic development, economic progress is supposed to be the preserve of the West. How could Japan, from Asia, an underdeveloped place, a place which is condemned not to develop, a Buddhist country, how could it develop? And so one Paul Bayrock, a Belgian economist, made a thorough study of the economic development of different nations from 1750 to 1918. And he came out with a surprising finding that in 1750, if you draw the economic development statistics of the world, it would look like this. China, 32.8% share in global GDP. China was the top country in 1750 with 33% of world GDP. India second with 25% of world GDP. UK, one of the last with 1.8% of the world GDP. America with 0.1% of world's GDP. He said these are the structure of the world economy in 1750. And India went down from 24.5 in 1750 to 20 in 1800, 17 in 1830, 8 in 1880, 1.7 in 1900. In just 150 years, the Indian economy, the Indian polity, the Indian society, the Indian civilization crashed. And the same thing happened to China. From 33% in 1750, China became 6% in 1900. And in the same period, UK and US, which had just 2% between them in 1750, their share went up to 41% in 1900. This completely transformed, paradigm shifted, transferred the power, economic power, political power, cultural power, civilizational power from Asia to the West. When Paul Bayrock came up with this theory, the West was stunned. Ferdinand Braudel, a very well-known French historian, he said that Europe, unlike today, far from having reached a level of wealth vastly superior to the living standards of the rest of the world, it's not correct. Others had much better standard of living than us. Then Bayreuth and Leboya, they wrote in 1981, it is very likely that in the middle of the 19th century, the average standard of living in Europe was a bit lower than the standard of living of the rest of the people in the world. This shook the West. The West was always superior. How is it that the Western researchers have shown that Asia was a mighty economic giant and India was an economic giant? And so this job was given. Even London Economist noted it in 1990. Then Angus Madison, the greatest economic historian ever, he was given the responsibility by the OECD countries to test and verify whether Paul Bayreuth's research was correct or not. It was not a single man's research. They instituted what is known as a Development Studies Institute. All the 20 countries funded it, and he was given a fleet of research scholars to work with, and Angus Madison started his work like this. If Bayreuth is right, then much more of the backwardness of the third world, that is Asia, presumably has to be explained by colonial exploitation, and much less of Europe's advantage can be due to scientific precocity, continued slow accumulation of wealth, and organizational financial superiority. You cannot say it happened, our growth happened because of this. It has to be with colonial exploitation. This is how Angus Madison started the work and said that Paul Bayreuth cannot be correct. And Angus Madison came out with the final conclusion in the year 2001. Until June 2010, Angus Madison kept on publishing his researches, in which he said he drew a 2000-year economic history of the world, starting from the first year of the common era called AD. He said, if you look at the economic statistics in the year 2000, in the year 1 of the common era, India tops the world with 34% of world GDP, China next. In the year 1000, if you draw the economic statistics, India still leads with 28%. In the year 1400, India again leads. In the year 1500, India again leads. In the year 1600, China overtakes India. In the year 1700, India overtakes China. And Angus Madison came to the conclusion that Indian economic crash occurred essentially and wholly because of colonial exploitation. When I mentioned this to the IIT students, scholars, researchers, academics, they were stunned. No one knew. And Adi Gandrij was also there. It's all available on the YouTube. You can see both the lectures. And after I completed the lecture, and of course I said more, which I will say here, and all of them came and surrounded. Sir, you don't stop with giving this lecture. We want you to run a course for us. And I ran a course for them in the first quarter of this year. I took 21-hour course for the entire MBA students, in which many research scholars, academics also participated. Why I am mentioning this is that the tallest educational institution of India had no understanding of Indian economic history, which is now proved. Actually, if you want to look at the Angus Madison's work, he is known as World Economic History, a Millennial Perspective. It is available on the internet of OECD even today. You know what is OECD countries? It is 26 richest countries in the world, and its statistics are most trusted and relied upon. It is that OECD forum which has declared this as the most authentic economic history of the world. The benefit of this study, Karl Marx did not have. The benefit of this study, Max Weber did not have. The benefit of this study, Galbraith did not have, nor Mr. Professor Raj Krishna. But still, day before yesterday, I see articles being written about the Hindu rate of growth. You can understand the divergence between the truth and the myth. The myth about India, which has settled in our mind, has made us debrand India, devalue the Indian society, and all the problems of India we attribute to the Indian society. Take for instance just the gender phenomena. That Indians kill their girl